Donald Trump has signed an executive order to establish what's called a sovereign wealth fund. Now wait, don't click away because I get it, this already sounds boring. But hopefully that's the only time you will hear me say those three words together for the rest of this video. Because really, what Trump is talking about is stockpiling and investing US wealth instead of spending it.
It's a very exciting event. We're going to have a sovereign wealth fund, which we've never had. I think in a short period of time, we'd have one of the biggest funds.
It's basically like creating a giant government piggy bank, except you don't just stuff it full of coins and cash and tax revenue. You also plug it right into the stock market. You invest that money.
The whole purpose is to keep that wealth for grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren.
But here's a riddle. How do you stockpile money when you have no money to stockpile?
U.S. government debt is now the highest in history.
$35 trillion in debt.
The deficit went up 40%. Spending is out of control.
And that's not where the questions stop, because this piggy bank money that a country might typically invest long term, Trump already has ideas about how he would spend the money.
We're going to be doing something perhaps with TikTok and perhaps not, but I have the right to do that. And we might put that in the sovereign wealth fund.
So with all the usual caveats that Trump has provided no actual details about how any of this would work, how would this work? And maybe more importantly, why set government money aside in a special investment fund if you're already planning to spend it? So to understand how this new investment fund might work, you have to understand how these investment funds typically work. It's not a new idea. There are all kinds of examples, dozens and dozens of them worldwide. Even the US has more than 20 of them in some form at the state level. But they're a little less common at the national level. On that count, there are only around 30 or so in the whole world. One of the biggest is in China. And if you've ever wondered how Alibaba seemed to burst onto the scene as an Amazon competitor out of nowhere, one of its earliest investors was China's sovereign wealth fund. I mean, the fund. Norway's fund is well known too because it's also the world's biggest, right now valued at almost 1.8 trillion US dollars. And here's something really cool to notice. This segment of each bar, that's their return on investment. So essentially, most of their fund is made up of all the money that their money made on the stock market. That's the power of long-term investing.
We'll create America's own sovereign wealth fund to invest in great national endeavors, everything from highways to airports and to transportation, infrastructure, all of the future.
But here's the snag. The one thing most of these government-run investment funds have in common is that they have wealth to invest to begin with.
Many countries fund their sovereign wealth funds with oil revenue or trade surpluses.
The key word there being surpluses. Norway, just to bring them up again, pulls in a lot of oil and gas revenue each year, enough to run an annual budget surplus, which it can then deposit into its piggy bank. But while no one in the world produces more oil than the United States, the US also spends everything it earns, and then some.
The US, on the other hand, has $2 trillion deficit. Our piggy bank is already empty.
That's right. The US deficit last year was just under $2 trillion, which put the total debt last year for 2024 at $35 trillion, give or take $500 billion. And in the last 20 years or so, it hasn't really mattered which party was in office. That debt has just continued to go up and up and up. So this is the first question Trump will have to answer if he's going to establish a government investment fund that's flush with cash. Where are you getting the cash?
We're going to monetize the asset side of the U.S. balance sheet for the American people. We're going to put the assets to work, and I think it's going to be very exciting.
Okay, let's work with that. The U.S. could monetize assets. Assets could be anything. Land, real estate, infrastructure, resources, military equipment, anything physical that the country owns. According to the White House, the federal government directly holds more than $5.7 trillion in public assets. Indirectly, they say, if you include reserves in oil, minerals, natural gas, the sum is even higher. Monetizing these things, well, the U.S. could sell them, could also borrow against them by issuing bonds, for example. There are downsides to this approach, of course, because it's like a mortgage. If you take out a loan, you pay interest. That's an expense. You hope that you make more on the stock market than you're paying.
I mean, just think about the math. Right now, the United States is long-term borrowing at 4.5%. You know, long-term, if we invested all the money in the stock market, we should have about an 8% return. So you think, okay, we should make a little bit of money by doing that. But of course, every year the market does not go up.
And meantime, it's your house that's collateral.
We've always been very conscious, right, of the scale of government debt in the U.S. And so if this is a situation where we're going to significantly increase it in order to fund a sovereign fund, I think that's the kind of thing that has got to stand up to scrutiny. I've studied funds like this for probably 15 years, and I've never really seen one that's effectively worked when it's been entirely funded through leverage.
But another option is to use tariffs.
Tariff. We'll put tremendous amounts of money through all this money that will be taken in through tariffs and other intelligent things, and we'll have the greatest sovereign wealth fund of them all.
But how many things can tariffs realistically pay for? The proposed tariffs on Canada and Mexico have already been paused, and as was the case with Trump's first term, he has no shortage of things that he wants to use that tariff money for.
It will be massive amounts of money pouring into our treasury, all reducing our deficit.
We're talking about including childcare.
And we want to keep people's taxes low and actually make them lower.
They're already allocated for other policies. On the campaign trail, Trump said it would be used to invest in medical research and in infrastructure projects, including highways, airports, and manufacturing hubs.
So look, there's a lot we don't know about how the fund might work and what other things the U.S. might have to forego spending money on to make this work, like infrastructure, border security, social spending, military spending. Who knows? Because, and I can't underscore this enough, the U.S. already spends more money than it has. This has been the case for almost a quarter century. Republicans, Democrats, doesn't matter. They've all spent more money than they have. So all that piggy bank money is an illusion. Unless we see details to the contrary. But let's set all that aside, because we still haven't explained why Donald Trump might want to create a fund with money the US doesn't have to buy something it can already buy if it wanted to.
As of today, TikTok is back. I think we would have a joint venture with the people from TikTok. So I have a warm spot in my heart for TikTok.
TikTok's potential new owner could be the U.S. government.
President Trump is suggesting the fund could help finance the purchase of TikTok.
Buying a massive enterprise like TikTok would require congressional approval because Congress controls the purse strings. And Republicans and Democrats would likely have all sorts of legal and regulatory and political and national security questions to ask. But sovereign wealth funds, on the other, not sovereign wealth funds, these kinds of government-owned and controlled investment funds tend to have fewer controls, fewer governance structures.
Particularly in the case of the US, the president has also a particular strength in executive powers. So that will give you an extraordinary budget that is not controlled by the Congress men and women in Washington.
The number one reason that a sovereign wealth fund appeals to President Trump, and frankly that it appealed to folks in the Biden administration, is you can get around Congress. It was really hard, even for Biden, to get the $1 trillion infrastructure bill passed in 2021.
And you can look at that as being either just about efficiency and speed, or about being able to do what you want as president. For an extreme, really wild example of what that can look like, let's turn to Malaysia.
The massive embezzlement of billions of dollars from the 1MDB state fund was one of the world's biggest financial scandals and reverberated from Malaysia and Singapore.
It touched Wall Street, it touched Hollywood, it went to Vegas.
Essentially, the country's fund turned into a slush fund for the prime minister, and he went to jail for 12 years on corruption charges.
The fund was, many people would argue, usurped with respect to its management. A lot of the machinations, various other things associated with that fund really sort of demonstrate when you have either non-existing or very weak or poor governance structures. The entire fund and its investments became wound down over time.
Saudi Arabia is another example where there aren't really checks and balances on how this kind of money is spent, because in their case, the fund is controlled directly by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Norway, on the other hand, their fund works very differently. They've set up separate, independent institutions that make it hard for the government of the day to just pull a whole bunch of money out. There are also strict rules about how much of the fund can legally be withdrawn each year. Really, it all comes down to how the laws establishing the fund are written.
What money comes in, what money comes out of the fund, who decides what, and who is accountable to what and to whom. We have seen a lot of sovereign funds failing because they lack the basic governance and the basic fiscal rules.
There are different questions about who would oversee the fund and make the investment decisions. There are concerns include ensuring the fund isn't misused for political gains or personal gains.
So look, as with many of these kinds of stories, we're sort of back to where we started, because Trump has said very little about how this fund would work, if it even ever becomes a thing. But bottom line, are sovereign wealth funds unusual? No, not at all. Would it be unusual for the United States to have one? Yes, because every year it doesn't make money, it loses money. Do we know how Trump intends to use this investment fund? No, not really. And the fact of the matter is, we won't, until he tries.